Before dawn broke over France on October 13, 1307, something extraordinary was already in motion. In cities, villages, and fortified commanderies, royal soldiers advanced with sealed orders they were forbidden to open until that morning. When the sun finally rose, it revealed a nation acting as one. Doors were forced open, swords were drawn, and the most powerful military order in medieval Europe was taken completely by surprise. The timing was no accident. Friday the 13th was not yet a superstition, but it would become one, forever linked to this moment. Hundreds of Knights Templar were arrested simultaneously from Paris to the provinces, accused of crimes so shocking they defied belief. What unsettles historians is not merely the brutality of the arrests, but their precision. Medieval governments were slow, fragmented, and plagued by delays. Yet this operation unfolded with near-perfect synchronization. For such coordination to succeed, the plan had to be prepared months, perhaps years, in advance. Messengers traveled quietly, instructions memorized, loyalties tested. No leaks surfaced. No warnings reached the Templars. An order famous for its intelligence networks and vigilance. It was as if the trap had been invisible until the moment it closed. Chroniclers later described the arrests as sudden, but suddenness was an illusion. Behind the silence lay careful planning, whispered alliances, and documents that told soldiers where to go and whom to seize. Those documents existed. They had to. Yet none survive today. This is where the mystery begins. The Templars fell in a single morning, but the paper trail explaining how it was done fades immediately. If the plan was hidden in plain sight, then the real question is not how the knights were betrayed, but who made sure the evidence of that betrayal would disappear. When the accusations were finally read aloud, disbelief rippled even through a medieval audience accustomed to superstition. The Knights Templar were charged with worshiping a mysterious idol, denying Christ, spitting on the cross, and exchanging obscene kisses during secret initiation rites. These claims sounded less like legal charges and more like fragments of a nightmare stitched together to provoke horror rather than understanding. What makes the accusations unsettling is how poorly they fit the order's public life. The Templars were monks bound by vows, warriors who fought and died under the sign of the cross. Their chapels were austere, their rules strict, their reputation built on discipline. To accuse them of elaborate heretical rituals required a suspension of logic that many contemporaries quietly struggled to maintain. Even medieval chroniclers, rarely sympathetic to fallen institutions, expressed doubt. Some recorded the charges with visible hesitation, noting contradictions between testimonies and the implausibility of uniform secret practices across thousands of men spread across continents. Others hinted that the confessions sounded rehearsed, as if answers were being shaped to fit predetermined questions. The charges also shared a familiar pattern. Similar accusations had been used before against unpopular groups, heretics, and political enemies. Idol worship and ritual desecration were convenient labels, instantly damning and difficult to disprove. Once spoken, they shut down debate. No further explanation was required. This raises a darker possibility. If the charges were unbelievable, perhaps they were not meant to be believed at all. Perhaps they functioned as noise, drawing attention away from something more precise, more dangerous, and far less theatrical. Financial secrets, political leverage, or knowledge that challenged authority would have required silence, not spectacle. By flooding the record with scandal, the trials buried subtler truths beneath layers of shock. What historians are left with is a question that refuses to fade. Were these accusations the crime or merely the cover story? That uncertainty lingers today because when the charges collapse under scrutiny, the silence surrounding what replaced them grows louder, hinting that something vital was intentionally hidden from view by forces still unnamed in surviving records today now. At first, the machinery of justice appeared thorough. Scribes sat beside inquisitors, dipping quills into ink and recording every question, every pause, every trembling answer. Confessions were written down line by line, often copied multiple times, forming the backbone of what should have become one of the most detailed trial archives of the medieval world. For a brief moment, the record feels solid. Names appear, dates align, testimonies unfold in careful sequence. We can trace how a knight was arrested, questioned, pressured, and eventually broken or defiant. Retractions are noted, contradictions preserved, margins filled with clarifications meant to resolve confusion. It gives the illusion of transparency, as though nothing important was left unsaid. Then, without warning, the continuity collapses. Midway through testimonies, references appear to earlier statements that no longer exist. Scribes mention annexes, sealed confessions, or supplemental interrogations, yet the pages themselves are gone. Entire sessions vanish between one entry and the next, leaving only the implication that something was said, which later readers were never meant to see. Historians searching the archives encounter these fractures repeatedly. A confession summarized but not preserved, a verdict issued without its supporting testimony, a name crossed out with no explanation. These are not the slow losses of time and decay. They are precise absences, appearing exactly where the narrative should deepen. What makes this more disturbing is how often later documents acknowledge the missing material. Officials clearly believed the records still existed. They cite them, rely on them, and move forward as if the foundation were intact. Somewhere between their time and ours, that foundation was quietly removed. The result is a historical echo chamber. We hear voices speaking about documents we cannot read, arguments built on pages we cannot touch. The trials begin with confidence and end in fragmentation, leaving modern scholars staring into gaps that feel less like accidents and more like deliberate erasures, carefully placed where answers might have become dangerous. Those gaps remain, daring historians to ask what truths were removed, who ordered it, and why silence was safer than afterward. The medieval Inquisition did not rely on chance or discovery. It relied on a system refined over decades, designed to produce certainty where doubt was dangerous. Suspects were isolated from allies, deprived of sleep, and confronted repeatedly with the same questions until resistance weakened. Truth in this environment was less important than consistency. Torture was not always the first tool, but it was always present, looming as an unspoken threat. Prisoners knew what awaited them if their answers failed to satisfy. Under such pressure, confession became a form of survival. Words were shaped not by memory, but by fear, and over time, those words hardened into official truth. Yet when historians examine the Templar confessions closely, something feels wrong. The testimonies do not align as neatly as the system demanded. Some knights describe elaborate rituals in vivid detail, while others deny them outright or confess to entirely different acts. Certain phrases repeat across regions, suggesting coaching, but elsewhere the language shifts, as though a different agenda were guiding the questions. More troubling still are confessions that do not follow the expected arc. Instead of gradual breakdown, some knights immediately admit guilt, while others hold firm through torture only to confess later under unclear circumstances. A few even confess, retract, and then confess again with altered details. This inconsistency hints that not every interrogation sought the same outcome. If the goal were simply to prove heresy, uniformity would have mattered. Instead, the record suggests experimentation. Different inquisitors probing different angles, pressing for different answers. It raises the possibility that certain interrogations were less about confirming charges and more about extracting specific information. What that information might have been remains unclear because the confessions that diverge most sharply are often the ones least preserved. What survives is enough to condemn, but not enough to explain. And that imbalance fuels a quiet suspicion. The Inquisition may have been manufacturing confessions, but not always for the same reason and not always for the story that ultimately reached the public record. According to canon law, the trials of the Knights Templar should have left behind an overwhelming abundance of paperwork. Medieval legal culture was obsessed with documentation. Every interrogation was meant to be recorded, copied, verified, and stored in multiple locations to prevent exactly the kind of uncertainty historians face today. Redundancy was not optional, it was the law. For an order as vast and controversial as the Templars, the volume of records should be immense. Local transcripts were to be sent to regional authorities. Summaries were forwarded to bishops. Key documents were duplicated and dispatched to Rome. In theory, the same testimonies should echo across archives, surviving even if one collection was lost to fire, war, or neglect. Yet when scholars follow this parchment trail, it abruptly thins. Early documents survive in clusters, but as accusations become more detailed and politically sensitive, the copies vanish. Entire chains of correspondence end mid-sentence. References appear to reports reviewed, approved, or condemned, but the reports themselves are missing. It is as though the system worked perfectly until it didn't. This absence is difficult to explain through accident alone. Medieval archives are incomplete, but randomness leaves uneven scars. What we see instead is selective loss. The more specific the allegation, the more fragile the documentation becomes. The more powerful the implication, the less evidence survives to support it. Officials at the time clearly believed the records existed. They cite them confidently, base decisions on them, and move forward without hesitation. Their certainty suggests they were not inventing sources, but relying on a material that was real and accessible in their own moment. Somewhere between then and now, that legal backbone was stripped away. The question is not whether documents were lost, but why the losses cluster so precisely around the most revealing moments of the trials. Canon law demanded abundance. What we inherited instead is scarcity, and scarcity of this kind rarely happens without intention. The most unsettling clues are not found in what medieval scribes wrote, but in what they deliberately left untouched. Blank margins interrupt dense testimony. Lines end abruptly, followed by fresh paragraphs that leap ahead in time. In some manuscripts, handwriting changes mid-page, as if one scribe stopped and another took over without explanation. These anomalies appear again and again across Templar trial records. A reference to an annexed confession, followed by nothing. A note indicating further testimony to be appended, yet no appendix survives. In several cases, verdicts are recorded cleanly, but the interrogations justifying them are absent entirely. The structure remains. The substance is gone. This is not the silence of decay. Parchment does not selectively rot. Ink does not vanish only where meaning concentrates. What we see instead resembles interruption, a process paused, redirected, or quietly edited after the fact. Someone made a decision that the flow of information should stop here. Even more telling is how later officials write around these gaps. They do not acknowledge missing material. They continue as if the reader already knows what cannot be read. That confidence suggests the silence was invisible to them or deliberately normalized so it would raise no questions. In some cases, erased passages leave faint impressions beneath the surface, shadows of letters pressed into parchment fibers. Modern technology has revealed hints of text deliberately scraped away, not lost. These are moments when silence becomes physical, embedded into the record itself. The result is a narrative punctured by quiet voids. The ink speaks loudly, but the absences speak louder. They suggest not confusion, but control, not negligence, but choice. And once that possibility is considered, every blank space becomes unsettling, because it hints that the most important truths of the Templar trials were not argued, disproven, or defeated. They were simply never allowed to be read again. By the early 14th century, the French crown was drowning in debt, and at the center of that financial web stood the Knights Templar. For decades, the order had acted as bankers to kings, safeguarding royal treasuries, financing wars, and managing complex transfers of wealth across Europe. King Philip IV relied on them heavily, borrowing vast sums to fund conflicts and sustain his court's ambitions. On parchment, this relationship looked respectable, even necessary. In reality, it placed the king in a deeply uncomfortable position. He was indebted not to rival nobles or foreign rulers, but to an independent military order that answered only to the Pope. The Templars controlled fortresses, funds, and financial records that exposed the fragility of royal power. Eliminating the order meant eliminating the debt. Their assets could be seized, their ledgers silenced, their claims erased by fire and decree. This motive is often cited as the primary reason for Philip's actions, and it is undeniably powerful. Yet it does not explain everything. If money were the sole concern, the trials could have been swift and bureaucratic. Instead, they were theatrical, prolonged, and obsessively documented. The level of secrecy surrounding the records, the care taken to control testimony, and the disappearance of key documents suggests something more than financial desperation. Debt alone does not require silence. It requires force. Silence implies fear of exposure, and that raises an unsettling possibility that within the Templars' financial dealings lay information capable of undermining not just the king's treasury, but his legitimacy. If so, erasing the order was not merely an economic solution. It was an act of self-preservation, carefully disguised as moral justice, and supported by a record that would later be carefully trimmed of anything too revealing. One of the most damning revelations to emerge from surviving correspondence is the timeline itself. King Philip's orders for mass arrests were issued before Pope Clement VI had formally sanctioned any action against the Templars. This detail shifts the entire balance of power. The Church was not leading the charge, it was being forced to follow. Royal letters reveal a king acting with confidence, even impatience. Instructions were sent to officials across France, commanding secrecy and obedience. The language is not deferential, it assumes compliance. By the time papal approval was publicly expressed, the arrests were already complete. This reversal unsettles traditional narratives. The medieval church is often portrayed as the dominant authority, but here it appears reactive, pressured into legitimizing decisions already made. Clementavadu's later hesitation and private doubts suggest he understood the danger of resisting. If the king controlled the arrests, he also controlled the flow of information. Royal officials gathered testimonies, managed archives, and decided which documents were shared beyond France. The church, dependent on these records, inherited a narrative shaped elsewhere. This explains the strange tone of later papal decisions. Clement dissolves the order without formally condemning it for heresy, a legal compromise that satisfies the crown without fully endorsing its claims. It is the decision of a man boxed in by forces he cannot openly challenge. In this light, the missing records take on new meaning. If Philip dictated the process, he could dictate what survived it. Control of the narrative required control of the paper trail, and once the church accepted records filtered through royal hands, the story of the Templars ceased to belong to Rome. It belonged to the throne. According to procedure, the most important French trial transcripts were to be sent to the Vatican for review. These documents would have allowed the Pope to independently assess the evidence, compare testimonies, and judge the legitimacy of the charges. References to these transfers appear in multiple sources. The documents were prepared, they were dispatched, and then they vanished. There is no record of their arrival in Rome, no acknowledgement, no catalog entry, no trace in papal archives. For historians, this absence marks a critical rupture. From this point onward, the Vatican relies largely on summaries and conclusions rather than raw testimony. Several explanations have been proposed. The documents may have been intercepted en route, quietly removed by royal agents before they crossed French borders. They may have arrived altered, stripped of sensitive material, or selectively copied. Or they may have been destroyed outright, deemed too dangerous to exist outside royal control. What makes this moment pivotal is its timing. The missing transcripts coincide with the most consequential phase of the trials, when contradictions were sharpest and royal motives most exposed. Without these records, Rome's ability to challenge the process collapsed. Later, papal documents speak with confidence about evidence they no longer possess. This suggests Clement the Misfun once saw material that we never will. Whatever conclusions he drew, they were shaped by documents that have since disappeared from history. This is the first undeniable break in the chain. Before it, gaps raise suspicion. After it, absence becomes the norm. And the Templar trials move forward on a foundation that no longer exists, leaving modern historians staring at a silence that began the moment the truth left France and never arrived in Rome. Pope Clement IX never fit the image of a crusading inquisitor. Elevated to the papacy through political compromise, he ruled during a period when papal authority was increasingly vulnerable to royal pressure. From the beginning of the Templar crisis, his private letters reveal a man uneasy with the role he was expected to play. Correspondence between Clement and trusted advisors shows skepticism toward the accusations. He questioned the reliability of confessions extracted under duress and expressed concern that the process had begun without proper ecclesiastical oversight. In several letters, he refers to the matter as troubling rather than resolved, a subtle but telling choice of words. What emerges is a portrait of hesitation. Clement delays decisions, calls for additional inquiries, and insists on papal examinations independent of French inquisitors. These actions suggest a pope trying to regain control of a narrative already slipping from his grasp. Yet alongside doubt, there is fear. Clement was acutely aware of King Philip's power and unpredictability. France surrounded the papacy both politically and militarily, and resistance carried real consequences. The Pope's court was not immune to intimidation. This tension explains Clement's contradictory behavior. Publicly, he allowed proceedings to continue. Privately, he questioned their legitimacy. He appears to have been caught between conscience and survival. If Clement believed the charges were exaggerated or false, his silence becomes significant. Silence under such circumstances is rarely neutral. It suggests the presence of knowledge that could not be safely spoken, and that possibility invites a haunting question. What did the Pope understand about the Templars that made open defiance impossible even from the highest religious authority in Christendom itself? In 2001, a forgotten document surfaced in the Vatican archives, unnoticed for centuries. Known as the Chinon Parchment, it recorded a papal inquiry conducted in 1308, in which senior Knights Templar were questioned directly by papal envoys. Its contents stunned historians. The parchment revealed that Jacques de Molay and other leaders confessed to minor ritual irregularities, but were absolved of heresy by the Pope himself. They were reconciled with the Church, not condemned by it. This directly contradicted the narrative that had defined the order's destruction for generations. The implications were explosive. If the Templars had been absolved, then the justification for their execution and dissolution collapsed. The Church had not found them guilty of the crimes that destroyed them. Even more unsettling was how the parchment survived at all. It had been misfiled, cataloged incorrectly, and effectively lost. Its rediscovery was not the result of intention, but chance. That accident reframes everything. If such a critical document could vanish so completely, how many others were removed more deliberately? The Chinon Parchment suggests a parallel history, one in which papal judgment differed sharply from royal action. Its survival feels less like preservation and more like a mistake that history forgot to correct, and mistakes invite speculation. If this parchment escaped erasure, perhaps it was not alone. Perhaps it is the lone survivor of a broader record quietly dismantled. The Chinon Parchment does not resolve the mystery of the Templars. It deepens it, revealing that the official story was never as unified as later centuries believed. As revelatory as the Chinon Parchment is, its silences are just as important as its words. The document summarizes conclusions but omits the full interrogations that led to them. It references examinations conducted, statements heard, and clarifications made, yet none of that supporting material survives. Scholars quickly noticed these gaps. Medieval papal inquiries were rarely so concise. They generated transcripts, witness statements, and theological analyses. The Chinon Parchment reads like a final page, detached from the body it once belonged to. Several lines imply attached testimonies, yet no attachments exist. This absence has fueled speculation that the most sensitive material was removed, not lost, but separated. If the interrogations included explanations of Templar rituals, financial practices, or political entanglements, their disappearance becomes meaningful. Such information could have complicated the Church's position or exposed conflicts it preferred to avoid. What remains is a sanitized record, stripped of texture. It tells us absolution occurred, but not why it was justified. It confirms doubt, but conceals its source. This selective preservation mirrors the broader trial record. Conclusions survive, processes vanish, outcomes remain, evidence dissolves. The Chinon Parchment stands as proof that missing documents are not hypothetical. They once existed. Their absence is a choice made by someone at some point who decided certain explanations carried too much risk. And so the parchment becomes a doorway rather than an answer. It opens onto a room that has been emptied, leaving only the unsettling sense that what was removed mattered far more than what was allowed to remain. The earliest testimonies given by the Knights Templar feel uncertain, almost fragile. When the first interrogations began, many knights denied the charges outright. Their responses were brief, cautious, and often inconsistent, as if they were struggling to understand what they were being accused of. Some insisted they had never witnessed anything improper. Others admitted confusion, claiming they did not fully understand the questions being asked. These early confessions lack the confidence and detail that would later define the trial record. They wander, contradict themselves, and occasionally trail off into silence. In several cases, knights acknowledge rumors but deny participation. They speak like men caught off guard, not conspirators exposed. What makes these testimonies unsettling is how abruptly they change. Later records show some of the same men offering elaborate confessions that directly contradict their earlier statements. Rituals become clearer, details multiply, certainty replaces hesitation. Yet the documents rarely explain what caused this transformation. There are no notes of new evidence, no acknowledgement of prolonged detention, no explanation for the sudden clarity. The shift appears on parchment as if it were natural, even inevitable. But human memory does not work this way. Historians studying these reversals are left uneasy. Either the knights lied at first and later told the truth, or something intervened between those moments. The record offers no guidance. What survives suggests a narrative slowly forced into shape. Early resistance gives way to conformity, not through persuasion, but through pressure invisible to later readers. The first testimonies hint at a truth still fluid, still contested before it hardened into something safer for those in control. The transition remains unexplained, and that silence invites doubt that cannot easily be dismissed. As the trials progressed, a new and dangerous phase emerged. Knights who had confessed under interrogation began to recant publicly. Standing before church officials or gathered crowds, they declared their earlier statements false, claiming they were extracted through fear, pain, or exhaustion. These retractions were acts of defiance, and they carried fatal consequences. Several knights paid for their reversals with their lives. Declaring innocence after confession was treated as relapse into heresy, punishable by death. Yet even knowing this, some still withdrew due to their admissions, suggesting a conviction stronger than fear. What is most disturbing is how these retractions vanish from the official summaries. In many trial records, confessions are preserved in detail, while the retractions that followed are omitted or reduced to vague references. In some cases, execution is recorded without any explanation of why the condemned knight was suddenly deemed irredeemable. The absence is striking. Retractions should have mattered. They challenge the legitimacy of the entire process. Instead, they are treated as inconvenient interruptions, quietly removed from the narrative. This selective preservation creates a distorted picture. Readers encounter confession after confession with little indication that many were later withdrawn. The record appears stable, even unanimous, when it was anything but. By erasing retractions, the trials become self-justifying. Confession leads to guilt. Guilt leads to punishment. Doubt is never allowed to surface. The result is a chilling realization. Some of the bravest moments in the Templar trials, when men chose death over falsehood, survive only as rumors and fragments. Their voices were silenced twice, once by fire and again by ink. When modern historians compare surviving confessions across regions, troubling patterns emerge. Testimonies from areas under direct royal control are often fragmented or missing entirely, while records from regions less dominated by the French crown appear more complete and less uniform. In royal strongholds, confessions tend to follow similar language and structure, as if shaped by a common template. In outlying regions, testimonies vary more widely, reflecting local circumstances and independent inquiry. This contrast suggests that influence, not truth, shaped preservation. Even more telling is which confessions disappeared. Testimonies that hinted at financial dealings, political pressure, or criticism of royal authority are disproportionately absent. What remains focuses narrowly on ritual accusations, safely distant from secular power. This pattern defies chance. If time and decay were responsible, losses would be random. Instead, absence clusters around sensitivity. The closer a document came to implicating royal interests, the less likely it was to survive. Historians cannot prove intent, but they cannot ignore consistency. Archives speak through survival, and survival here follows power. The trials begin to resemble not an investigation, but a filtration process. Thousands of voices entered. Only certain ones emerged intact. What vanished were not merely confessions, but alternatives, different explanations, competing truths. The result is a history narrowed by selection, leaving behind a question that still haunts scholarship. Were the Templars condemned by what they said, or by what was never allowed to remain written once it was said aloud? When the Templar trials spread beyond France, something unexpected happened. The tone changed. In England, the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Italy, interrogations were slower, less aggressive, and far less theatrical. Torture was used sparingly or not at all, and many knights were acquitted outright. Most striking of all, the records from these regions are noticeably more complete. Outside France, scribes preserved full testimonies, including denials and contradictions. Confessions were questioned rather than accepted at face value. In several regions, investigators openly doubted the French accusations, noting the lack of credible evidence and the suspicious uniformity of earlier confessions. This contrast is difficult to ignore. If the Templars were truly guilty of widespread heresy, the evidence should have emerged consistently across Christendom. Instead, the harshest judgments and the greatest archival gaps appear precisely where royal pressure was strongest. The disparity suggests that the disappearance of records was not the result of age or accident, but of geography. Where the French crown exerted influence, documents thin out. Where it did not, the paper trail remains intact. This uneven survival undermines the idea of a universal crime. It hints at a localized campaign driven by political necessity rather than shared discovery. And it raises an uncomfortable implication that the truth about the Templars may still exist, quietly preserved in places where no one felt compelled to destroy it. The Iberian Peninsula presents one of the most puzzling cases. In Spain and Portugal, Templar trials produced outcomes that directly contradicted the French narrative. Knights were largely absolved, accusations dismissed, and in Portugal, the order was quietly transformed rather than destroyed. Fragments of Iberian records survive, and they tell a calmer story. Testimonies emphasize routine religious life, financial administration, and military duty. Allegations of idol worship and ritual heresy appear rarely, and when they do, they are treated with skepticism. Yet within these same records are references to shared documents, Investigators mentioned transcripts received from France, summaries reviewed, and materials consulted that no longer exist anywhere. These references act like ghosts in the archive, pointing to a body of evidence that once circulated across borders. If those shared documents survived in Iberia, they might have clarified everything. Instead, they vanished completely, leaving behind only hints of their former presence. This silence is unsettling because it crosses jurisdictions. Spain and Portugal had little incentive to protect the French crown, yet the documents are gone all the same. Their disappearance suggests coordination beyond a single kingdom. Whether through church channels or political pressure, the same material was removed everywhere it appeared. What remains is contradiction without context. Iberian verdicts say innocence. French verdicts say guilt. And the documents that might explain the difference no longer exist. When historians step back and examine the broader pattern, coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to accept. Documents vanish, not randomly, but selectively. Across borders, languages, and legal systems, the same types of records disappear, often referenced but never preserved. Time alone cannot explain this. Wars destroy archives indiscriminately. Fires do not target specific testimonies. Yet here absence follows meaning. The most revealing documents are the least likely to survive. For such consistency to exist, human agency must be considered. Someone or several someones made decisions about what should endure and what should not. Those decisions crossed political boundaries and outlived the people who made them. This does not require a single conspiracy. It requires shared incentives, stability, authority, the avoidance of uncomfortable questions. Once the Templars were gone, preserving contradictory evidence served no purpose. Destroying it simplified history. The result is a continent-wide silence, punctuated by fragments that refuse to align. The gaps speak to effort, not neglect, to action, not decay. And in that realization, the mystery deepens. Because if the records vanished by design, then history itself was edited. And what was removed may have been the one version of events powerful enough to survive judgment, had it ever been allowed to remain. Long before modern banks existed, the Knights Templar created a financial system that spanned continents. Pilgrims could deposit money in one country and withdraw it in another, using coded documents understood only by the order. Kings trusted the Templars with treasuries, loans, and war funds. In effect, they operated a shadow infrastructure beneath medieval politics. This system granted the Templars something far more dangerous than wealth: information. They knew who owed whom, which kingdoms were solvent, and which rulers survived only by borrowed coin. Their ledgers mapped the hidden dependencies of power. For King Philip, this knowledge was a liability. Debt could be forgiven by force, but records could not be so easily erased. If Templar documents revealed the crown's financial weakness, they threatened not just the treasury, but royal authority itself. Some historians suspect the trials came dangerously close to exposing these mechanisms. Confessions occasionally hint at accounting practices, coded exchanges, and financial rituals misunderstood or ignored by inquisitors. Such testimony would have shifted the narrative from heresy to corruption, implicating secular power rather than condemning religious deviation. Those hints rarely survive intact. Where financial detail emerges, the record fractures soon after. Ledgers vanish, testimonies end abruptly. What remains is the accusation, not the explanation. If the Templars held the financial truth of medieval Europe, destroying them meant burying that truth as well. Heresy charges provided cover. Fire erased men. Silence erased numbers, and perhaps the most dangerous knowledge the Templars possessed was not mystical at all, but mathematical. Proof that kings ruled not by divine right, but by credit extended and favors owed, written in books no one was ever meant to read again. Beyond finances, rumors clung to the Templars of knowledge gathered far from Europe. The order had spent decades in the East, interacting with Islamic scholars, Byzantine theologians, and ancient traditions older than Latin Christianity. Exposure alone bred suspicion. Some testimonies hint at symbolic teachings rather than heretical belief. Ritual gestures misinterpreted as blasphemy may have been allegorical, rooted in Eastern symbolism unfamiliar to Western inquisitors. Silence, shadows, and secrecy amplified misunderstanding. Medieval Christianity struggled with ambiguity. Anything that resisted clear classification risked condemnation, yet condemning unfamiliar knowledge carried danger. To name it precisely was to acknowledge it existed. This may explain why accusations remain vague. Idols are mentioned, but never described clearly. Teachings are referenced, but not defined. The charges condemn without explaining, avoiding theological debate entirely. If the Templars possessed ideas that blurred boundaries between faiths, condemning them outright might have exposed the Church's own uncertainty. Erasure was safer than engagement. Surviving records suggest inquisitors often redirected conversations away from philosophy and toward ritual scandal. Symbol became crime, metaphor became heresy. What vanished may have been discussions too complex, too nuanced, or too revealing to preserve. Knowledge that could not be neatly labeled threatened authority by existing at all. In that light, the trials resemble not a search for truth, but a refusal to confront it. Some ideas were not destroyed because they were false, but because they could not be easily condemned without unraveling the certainty on which power depended. In medieval Europe, no accusation carried greater finality than heresy. Once applied, discussion ended. Evidence became secondary. Doubt itself was dangerous. The word transformed complexity into crime. During the Templar trials, heresy functions less as diagnosis than as tool. It resolves contradictions without explaining them. When testimony grew inconvenient, the label closed the record. This convenience is telling. If certain confessions threaten to expose political manipulation, financial dependency, or institutional weakness, refuting them would require debate. Debate risks visibility. Erasure is quieter. Heresy allowed authorities to bypass explanation entirely. Once declared, documents could be summarized, altered, or discarded without challenge. The verdict justified the silence. This pattern appears repeatedly. Where testimony complicates the narrative, it disappears. Where it supports condemnation, it survives. The label does the work of selection. What was lost were not just documents, but alternatives. Other ways to understand the order, other versions of events, other truths. Heresy simplified history. It reduced a complex organization into a moral failure, and in doing so, it protected institutions from scrutiny. If some testimonies were erased because they threatened authority more than belief, then the greatest danger the Templars posed was not religious deviation, but the exposure of systems built on secrecy. In that sense, heresy was not the crime, it was the solution. On a cold evening in March 1314, Jacques de Molay stood bound to a stake on an island in the Seine, facing death with no hope of reprieve. As flames were prepared, the former Grand Master of the Knights Templar did something the official record said he would never do. He denied everything. De Molay did not plead, he did not confess, he did not seek mercy. Instead, he publicly rejected the charges that had destroyed his order, declaring them false before God and man. Witnesses recorded his words with surprise, even discomfort. This was not the behavior of a broken heretic clinging to life. It was the defiance of a man who believed history had been rewritten around him. His declaration directly contradicted years of documented confessions attributed to him. According to trial records, de Molay had admitted guilt. According to his final words, those admissions were lies forced from him. One of these versions cannot be complete. What makes this moment so unsettling is that de Molay had nothing left to gain. Recanting meant death. Silence might have offered survival. Yet he chose truth, or what he believed to be truth, over life itself. If the official record were accurate, his denial would make no sense. But if that record had been shaped, edited, or incomplete, his final words become the missing piece. Fire erased his body. Time nearly erased his voice. But that contradiction remains, standing like a crack in the foundation of the trials, forcing historians to ask whether the last testimony of the Templars' leader reveals not madness, but a truth buried with him in the ashes. Jacques de Molay was not alone in dying without explanation. Across France, Templar executions appear in records stripped of context. Names are listed, dates are marked, outcomes are recorded. But the processes leading to death are absent. In several cases, knights were executed without surviving verdicts. There are no preserved sentences, no transcripts of final interrogations, no formal declarations of guilt. The administrative trail simply ends. This silence is disturbing because medieval legal systems were meticulous when enforcing capital punishment. Death required justification, especially for members of a powerful religious order. Yet here, justification evaporates. Some documents show names crossed out or annotated with brief notes indicating execution. No reason is given, no appeal is recorded. It is as though the decision needed no explanation. This pattern suggests urgency. Perhaps executions moved faster than paperwork, or perhaps paperwork was intentionally discarded once it had served its purpose. Without transcripts, historians cannot know what these men said in their final hours. Whether they confessed, recanted, or accused others disappears with them. The absence creates a vacuum where certainty should exist. It replaces legal process with assumption. Guilt is implied by outcome alone. These paperless deaths stand as one of the most chilling aspects of the trials. They imply a moment when documentation ceased to matter, when silence became more valuable than record, and when eliminating voices took priority over preserving truth for future generations. For the Knights Templar, death was not only punishment, it was erasure. Once a knight was executed, his testimony lost all power. He could no longer retract, clarify, or contradict the record written about him. This reality transformed execution into a tool of narrative control. A living prisoner could challenge authority, a dead one could not. In several cases, knights who recanted their confessions were executed swiftly. Their reversals survive only as brief mentions, if at all. With their deaths, the inconvenience vanished. Documents tied to executed knights often disappear soon after. Interrogations are missing. Notes end abruptly. It is as if the removal of the man justified the removal of his words. This suggests that some documents may have died with their subjects. Once testimony no longer served institutional needs, preserving it offered no benefit. Death closed the story. Silence sealed it. What remains is a record shaped by survival, not truth. Voices that aligned with authority endured. Voices that resisted were extinguished, both physically and archivally. The Templar trials did not end when the last knight died. They continued through omission, through selective memory, through the quiet decision to let certain words vanish forever. And in that absence lies the final tragedy. Not only were men burned, but the full account of what they knew, believed, and denied was burned with them, leaving history to wonder what truths were considered too dangerous to outlive their witnesses. When the Vatican gradually reopened its archives to modern scholars, expectations were immense. For centuries, the Church's records had existed behind layers of permission and secrecy, fueling the belief that definitive answers about the Templar trials waited patiently on forgotten shelves. Historians imagined unopened boxes, complete transcripts, and lost correspondence finally ready to speak. What they encountered instead was something far more unsettling. The archives contained references to files that were not there. Indexes pointed to collections that ended abruptly. Marginal notes cited testimonies that could not be located. The structure of a complete archive remained, but its contents were conspicuously incomplete. These were not vague allusions. Dates, titles, and shelf marks were precise. The absence was undeniable. It was as if someone had removed specific folders while leaving the catalog intact, confident no one would notice centuries later. For researchers, this discovery was disorienting. The archives did not reveal new answers. They revealed missing questions. Each reference to an absent document confirmed that something once existed and was later removed. The reopening did not resolve the mystery of the Templars. It confirmed it by exposing the negative space in the record. The Vatican archives showed that time alone could not explain what was gone. The silence was old, deliberate, and carefully preserved, waiting centuries to be noticed. Faced with these absences, historians split into opposing camps. Some argue the missing records never existed at all, suggesting medieval references were exaggerated, mistaken, or symbolic. In this view, modern scholars are chasing ghosts born of assumption rather than evidence. Others strongly disagree. They point to legal requirements, administrative habits, and consistent cross-referencing as proof that the documents once existed in physical form. For them, absence is not mystery, but result. The debate has become one of the most contentious in medieval studies. It forces historians to confront an uncomfortable reality. History is not just what survives, but what is allowed to survive. Those who deny intentional removal must explain why gaps appear most often where political pressure was strongest. Those who argue for deliberate erasure must confront the limits of proof when proof itself is missing. What unites both sides is uncertainty. The trials cannot be fully reconstructed. Every interpretation rests on fragments. This fragility unsettles traditional historical confidence. It suggests that truth is not fixed, but negotiated across time, shaped by survival rather than accuracy. In the Templar trials, the debate itself becomes evidence. When scholars cannot agree on what once existed, the power of those who controlled the record becomes unmistakable. The question shifts from what happened to what was permitted to be known. Even today, not all archives are open. Certain Vatican collections remain restricted, accessible only to select researchers, or entirely closed without public explanation. Officially, these limitations are administrative. Unofficially, they fuel suspicion. The restrictions are not random. They cluster around sensitive periods, political correspondence, and internal church deliberations. These are precisely the categories that could clarify the church's role in the Templar trials. No one publicly states that the missing records are hidden there, but the refusal to allow full access keeps the possibility alive. Silence becomes policy. For historians, this creates a paradox. The Church insists nothing remains to be revealed, yet maintains barriers that prevent confirmation. Trust is requested, but verification is denied. This ongoing secrecy suggests the story is unfinished, not because answers are certain, but because questions are still dangerous. Whether the restricted archives contain damning revelations or merely embarrassing uncertainty is unknown. But the act of restriction itself preserves doubt. Centuries after the fires burned out, access remains controlled. The past is still managed, and as long as some doors remain closed, the Templar trials cannot truly end. The absence of permission becomes the final piece of evidence, hinting that history's most uncomfortable truths are not always destroyed, but quietly locked away, waiting for a moment that may never come. History is not built from certainty, it is built from fragments, from pages that escaped fire, from voices that were allowed to remain, from records deemed acceptable to preserve. Over time, these fragments harden into narrative, and narrative becomes truth. But when fragments are selected rather than accidental, history stops being a record and becomes a construction. What survives shapes what is believed. What disappears reshapes memory without leaving fingerprints. The Templar trials expose this process with uncomfortable clarity. We do not possess a complete account. We possess what remained after decisions were made about what could endure. Confessions survive, retractions fade, conclusions remain, explanations vanish. This imbalance creates an illusion of coherence. The story appears finished because the contradictions are gone. Silence smooths the edges, yet that silence is not neutral. It actively directs interpretation. By removing complexity, it presents inevitability. Guilt feels obvious when doubt is absent. Historians are trained to work within this limitation, but the Templars push that limitation to its breaking point. Too many gaps align with power. Too many absences protect authority. In the end, what survives tells us less about what happened than about what was permitted to be remembered. The record becomes a mirror, reflecting not truth, but control. Officially, the Knights Templar were dissolved in 1312. Their properties were seized, their members scattered, imprisoned, or executed. On paper, the matter was resolved, but legally, something essential never occurred. The order was never definitively convicted of heresy by the Church. Pope Clement IX dissolved the Templars through administrative authority, not judicial condemnation. It was a solution that avoided a verdict. This distinction matters. Without conviction, the charges remain unresolved. The trials ended in silence rather than judgment. The missing records ensure this ambiguity persists. Without full transcripts, historians cannot reconstruct the process. Without process, guilt remains unproven. The Templars exist in a historical limbo, destroyed but not convicted, remembered as criminals but never conclusively proven to be so. This unresolved state explains why the story refuses to settle. New documents reignite debate. Old silences provoke new questions. The trial never truly ended because its foundation is incomplete. It relies on records that no longer exist. As long as those gaps remain, the verdict remains suspended. Not innocent, not guilty, just unfinished. And perhaps that uncertainty is the final legacy of the trials. A reminder that justice without transparency does not conclude. It lingers unresolved across centuries. The most unsettling possibility is not that the truth is hidden, but that it has been destroyed, that the most revealing testimonies, the most dangerous explanations, were erased so completely they cannot be recovered. If that is the case, history cannot correct itself. It can only circle absence. The Templar trials then become a warning, not about medieval injustice, but about the fragility of truth itself. Records can vanish, narratives can be shaped, silence can replace explanation, and if it happened once, it can happen again. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what the Templars hid, but why so much effort was invested in making us stop asking, why absence required coordination, why silence endured. The missing pages haunt history because they suggest fear, not fear of heresy, but fear of exposure. What survives tells one story. What vanished hints at another. Between them lies a question that may never be answered, only repeated. Whose interests were served by silence, and what truths were considered too dangerous to be allowed to outlive the men who knew them? If those pages are gone forever, then the verdict has already been delivered, not by law or faith, but by absence itself.